Okay, so I'm going to turn to reading some sources. I've got my big blue bookmark here, and I've got my source number 1, interview with Zondwa. And when I first start to read, I want to remind myself of why I'm reading. And it's this central question here up at the top. Is post-apartheid South Africa living up to its promises? That's going to be our purpose for reading. While we read, we're going to be using the bookmark to help us. And in social studies, we tend to start with the headnote and the attribution. While we're reading the headnote and the attribution, we're going to be thinking about these 4 questions. Who created this source? When and where was it created? What type of source is this? And why was it created? When we find information that helps us answer those questions, we're going to circle it. I'm going to read out loud and then talk about what I'm thinking while I'm reading. It says, attribution. Excerpt from an interview with Zondwa in the book After Freedom. I'm going to circle Zondwa here because that's a person's name. It's capitalized. So I'm guessing she's the person who said the words in this interview. She's the speaker. And I'm also going to circle interview because that tells me what type of source this is. Looks like the interview was in a book called After Freedom, The Rise of the Post-Apartheid Generation in Democratic South Africa, page 204, by Catherine S. Newman and Ariane de Lanoy, published by Beacon Press Books 2014. I'm going to circle these 2 women's names because they're the 2 people who wrote this book, and it sounds like they were actually the interviewers, so maybe they interviewed Zondwa as part of their research. This source is sort of unique because it has 2 authors, well, 3 authors, but 2 kinds of authors. It's got Zondwa, who spoke these words, and then 2 interviewers or researchers. I'm also going to circle the date when this was created, 2014. And I'm going to make a note that 2014 is 20 years after 1994, so it's 20 years after the end of apartheid. Now it's your turn. With a partner, read through the headnote and circle any additional information that you can find that tells us more about who created this source, more about them, and maybe more about why they might have created this source. Okay, now it's time to move to the actual source, the words that Zondwa said in her interview. While we read the source, we're going to be using this part of the bookmark, and we're going to be focused in on just this one question, number 3. What parts of the source tell you what the author thinks, wants, or experiences? That question is going to be helpful because in interviews like this, when somebody's being interviewed, they're usually talking about what they've experienced or what they think about something, and that's what we're looking for here. Zondwa says, as from 1994 up to this time, I feel like government has done a lot. I'm going to underline that because she's telling us what she thinks, that government has done a lot for her. The houses, things like pension, Social Security income. There was a certain age for us blacks that you could not get your pension. But now people get it. Even sick people get it. Back then, there was no such. That is why I'm saying now, I feel government has done a great deal. Things have become better, man. I'm going to underline what she says at the end here. I feel government has done a great deal and things have become better. Because that's telling us what she thinks and what she feels. And in the margin, I'm going to write a little note that, just to summarize what she thinks, Zondwa thinks that government has done a lot to make things better. And sometimes I write notes out in the margin while I'm reading, so that when I go back to to look at what I've read when I'm trying to write at the end of the investigation, I don't have to reread the whole source. I can look at my notes to kind of remind myself what I read. With a partner, read these last 2 paragraphs and underline anything Zondwa says or any parts of the source that tell you what she thinks, what she wants, or what she's experienced. Now it's time to do number 1, write a sentence. What's the main point of the person who created this? So what is Zondwa's perspective on whether post-apartheid South Africa is living up to its promises? With a partner, write 1 sentence. What do you think is Zondwa's opinion? Is post-apartheid South Africa living up to its promises according to Zondwa? You may have to reread parts of the source to try to answer this question in 1 sentence. All right, so just before we move on to the last part of reading, I want to review or recap what we've done together. We started with reading the head note and the head note and the attribution, and we were circling things to answer these 4 questions about who created the source, when, why. Then we read the source in Zondwa's words and underline anything that told us what she thought, wanted, or experienced. Then we wrote a 1-sentence summary about her perspective on whether or not South Africa has lived up to its promises. Now it's time for us to evaluate this source a little bit. We're wondering, is this source reliable for understanding whether post-apartheid South Africa is living up to its promises? And lucky for us, the back of our bookmark has some questions to help us think about reliability. So we're thinking about ways this could be reliable and ways that this could not be reliable. So 2 of the questions that stood out to me here are, was the person in a position to know about the issues? And was the person who created this an insider or an outsider? So what do we know about Zondwa? We know that Zondwa is a Black South African woman who experienced apartheid. She lived during apartheid, and she's talking about what her life was like then versus what her life is like now. This tells me that she's pretty reliable because she experienced apartheid and lived through it. She is an insider. And because this source actually has more than one author, Zondwa and the 2 researchers, let's think about them. These 2 interviewers or these 2 researchers, how reliable are they? We know from the head note that they are researchers who work for Johns Hopkins University and the University of Cape Town. So this is another reason this source could be reliable, because researchers actually collected this information, and I know that researchers have to do a lot of careful work and analysis and talk to a lot of different people before they can write something up. So I could also write that researchers collected this information. With a partner, find 1 to 2 other reasons why this source might be reliable, and you can use the back of the bookmark to help you. Now it's time for me to think about why or how this source may not be reliable. One thing that came to mind while I was reading is that Zondwa is only 1 person, and that South Africa is a very diverse country, and there are a lot of different kinds of people who live in South Africa, and they may not all feel the same way that she does. So I wonder how many other people think that things have gotten better like Zondwa. So that's a reason this may not be so reliable. It's only 1 person's point of view. And I'm wondering, what do other people think? What do other South Africans think? With a partner, brainstorm another reason why this source may not be reliable for answering our central question. All right, it's time for the last step. We're back on the front of the bookmark now. What parts of the source help us think about the central question, and draw boxes around those parts of the source? So with a partner, go back through the source and box anything that helps you think about whether or not post-apartheid South Africa is living up to its promises.